Good evening. My name is Mohsen Mostafavi. I'm the chairman of the Architectural Association. I'd like to welcome you to our conference tonight. Andrew Benjamin, in his presentation in this room earlier this afternoon on the discussion of city and citizenship, referred very briefly to Jacques Derrida's concept of hospitality, the relationship between host and guest, and the way in which this relationship works with guests that are already, in a sense, are among us. And for many of us, the conference, in some sense, is already halfway through, because it started last night at the NFT when we had the discussion, the conversation between Hanif Qureshi and Colin McCabe. But as this is the first time that we are all together, I think it's also a good opportunity for me to formally welcome you as the host institution to London, the Post-Colonial City, which, as you know, is a collaboration between the AA and the London Consortium, of which the AA is also a part. I'd very much like to thank all the people who've helped organize this conference and acknowledge my gratitude to Colin McCabe, head of the London Consortium, Paul Hurst, Laura Mulvey, and of course our very own Mark Cousins. During the conversation last night between Hanif Qureshi and Colin, Hanif talked about his experience of living in Bromley and coming to London on Saturdays, and how liberating, in a sense, it was, this experience of spending Saturdays on the King's Road and doing all the things that he couldn't do in Bromley. And I think this is an experience that many of us have shared, moving often from suburbs to cities. And it's in a sense undeniable that the city always provides the kinds of relationships, the sort of opportunities that are often impossible, in a sense, to attain in the suburbs. And somehow these kinds of relational conditions become also some sort of measure of the way in which relationships might be transformed or might occur in the suburbs themselves. Now, both, I think, the London Consortium and the AA, over the years, have been very much committed to discussing some of the issues that have been part and parcel of this conference. It's very clear that in the territory of literature, writing, visual arts, music, London, as a sort of, in a sense, a kind of post-colonial city, has been incredibly powerful and has had a very major impact. In the realm of architecture, there has been an incredible impact, but I think we have been, in some sense, slower to realize the full potential and the possibilities in terms of architecture and urbanism related to this particular topic. It's very much my hope that the conversations of last night, today, and tomorrow will really help us formulate more explicit relationships, more explicit discussion in terms of the question of architecture and urbanism. Tonight we have our main speaker of the evening, and it's my pleasure to ask Professor Colin McCabe to introduce Paul Gilroy.
Good evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Paul. Mohsen was the first to suggest this conference, and indeed the theme of this conference. And at our first meeting, when we sat down to talk about who might give the keynote address, there was unanimous and immediate agreement that that should be Paul Gilroy. And I think that is some indication of his stature as a thinker and a writer and an activist. Paul is a Londoner, born and bred. He spent some time in both Sussex and Birmingham, but it's from London that he has contributed his very original thinking about race, culture, and society. His first book, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, was probably the single most important contribution to the debate about what it might mean to be black and British in the 80s. And that work came out of the Birmingham Centre, came out of Paul's work in the GLC. But the next book, The Black Atlantic, seems even more remarkable to me in the sense that it took the whole history of European oppression and enslavement of Africans and really turned the map in another way to show how central Africa had been to the whole growth of European culture, reading, indeed, as the title says, The Black Atlantic, reading those roots in a very, very different and original fashion. His next book, Between Camps, is an attempt to understand how memories from the Second World War, memories of the fight against fascism, might actually be of real use in contemporary definitions of multiculturalism. Even that short description, I think, shows you the kind of originality of thinking which made Paul our choice and which makes me delighted to welcome him here now. Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Colin, for that very generous introduction. Just want to make sure these are working. No. There we are. Right. Well, it's an honour to be here and to have been asked to set the tone for what we're going to be doing over the next couple of days. There are lots of opportunities for sophistry, for wordplay, in thinking about the concept of post-coloniality. And there may be political gains to be made if that term can be made to promote coalition between marginalised and victimised people, whose misery is a residual product of the shocks that followed on from the loss of Britain's empire. But much of the vicissitudes of post-colonial theory hold very little scant appeal for me. The post-colonial character of contemporary London has a simple facticity about it, which leaves it outside of debate. And I think the spirit in which we engage that question during the next couple of days is absolutely critical. We can appreciate London's cosmopolitan vernacular, and we can see its vernacular cosmopolitanisms. We can focus on the patterns of resistance to both. We will observe the city's ethnographic complexities. Its perverse cultural details may bring pleasure as well as fear. But the temptation to evaluate, to try and assess contemporary London as though it could be a simpler, a more homogeneous, a less irreducibly diverse place is something we should regard with the utmost suspicion. That impulse is linked not only to fantasies of return, to the imaginary homogeneity of past whiteness and the restoration of Britain's imperial status. It's marked by the lingering suspicion that race, like the black bodies that are its primary bearers and signifiers, belongs somewhere else. And in turn, that can feed the comforting idea that true Brits have suffered from misguided social engineering, from a race relations industry that has curbed their instinctive responses of suspicion and hatred with the blunt instrument of the law. And at their worst, those views endorse an analysis of empire and colony as essentially unrelated to the ecologies of belonging created in the core of the old imperial system. Colonial history then gets allocated and confined to its victims, and any post-colonial opportunities remain theirs alone. Well, I want to suggest a different orientation, one that has the additional merit of bypassing any leftover agonizing about what it might mean to be black and British. And it's premised on the idea that colonial cultures and aspirations and mentalities extended into and conditioned the life of this metropolis in the most intimate ways, the most comprehensive ways, over very long periods of time. The boundaries of post-coloniality become blurred, but its irreversibility now constitutes a starting point. And from that angle, the basic idea of post-colonial London has such a vivid, such a clanging obviousness about it, that to unwittingly endorse a game of post-colonial London for and against would be absurd. To engage in sport of that type brings new dangers, now that the invention of conservatism, the reinvention of conservatism, is seeking a new language and a new imagery with which to revive and legitimate the oldest of ultranationalist and racist anxieties. The close associations between the history of Britain's phobic responses to the difficult presence of difference and the life of this city have been repeatedly overlooked. We don't remember this stuff. It's there and then it's gone. Sustained confrontations with same and different, with black and white, between native and interloper have been staged here for the benefit of the national community in urban environments, usually, though not only, those that London has supplied. The politics of race and representation has produced a cavalcade of mythic figures: illegal immigrants, black power militants, maimed imams, muggers, dreads, posses, yardies, steamers, gangsters, fundamentalists, holy smokes, only a few of the horrifying characters that have brought inner London's testing encounters with Middle England to life. Their powers enhanced where they have been revealed to prey upon the wholesome, beleaguered and inappropriately tolerant responses of lost and lonely people, whose roots, we were told, went deeper into the local landscape than anything the immigrants could ever manage. Conservative and nationalist opponents of Britain's post-colonial culture produced some grim evidence, drawn from the destruction and transformation of London's inner cities to support their cause. In their populist political imagination, new Commonwealth immigrants completed the tasks that Hitler's Luftwaffe had been unable to accomplish. And those noisy alien encampments that had sprung up where peace and quiet had formerly reigned supplied proof of a catastrophic confrontation between incompatible cultures and civilizations. Charles Moore, now editor of the Daily Telegraph, spoke for this whole tendency in 1982 in his response to the Scarman report on the Brixton riots, and he offered a memorable diagnosis of Lambeth's ills, which he linked both to mass immigration and to the other statist perfidies of modernizing labour and government. Unhappiness exists, I'm quoting Moore now, because an old and coherent way of life has been broken up, not really by the ordinary passage of time, or even by increased prosperity, but by the acts of politicians and administrators. Powers of planning and social control have changed the appearance and character of Lambeth without the wishes of the inhabitants. Old people have had to leave the streets they liked because of redevelopment, and many of them have been put in blocks amongst people they do not know. Added to omnipotent planning has been mass immigration, a matter in which the people most affected were even less consulted. The immigration has been large, and the bulk of it concentrated in places like Lambeth. The native population of Lambeth feels little natural sympathy with the West Indian arrivals. Without having a dogmatic or arrogant theory of racial superiority, the old people of Lambeth can see with their own eyes that they are surrounded by people more primitive than they, who lack their respect for law and privacy. Oh no, that's the wrong one. How do I go back? I go back that way. I suppose the background to our discussions is, on one level, constructed by the transition of that to that. The celebrants and the defenders and the advocates of anti-racist and multicultural Britain have contested Charles Moore's feeble and duplicitous projection of recent urban history. For them, London's rich cultural life during the last 30 or 40 years suggests a different utopia from their mixture of high Anglicanism, Powell and Hayek that Moore still apparently peddles. Their counter-history accentuates the themes of cultural mixture, class-based commonality and democratic mutual regard. It became crucial to establishing the currency of another widespread and myth-enveloped notion which suggests that the British case has provided the best example currently of what Europe can offer as to what a successful multicultural society looks and feels like. Here again, the more recent history of I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button. It's difficult to remember. Right, okay, it's that one. Here again, the more recent history of post-colonial London has acquired an extra burden. It's been called upon to substantiate a deep political transition, characterized in part by the dwindling of overt and articulate, what might be called politically motivated racism. The extravagant events, the more extravagant versions of that hopeful claim have been dented by recent events. Everything in Britain's post-colonial garden is not rosy. Racial hierarchy structures the life of this city in multiple ways. And we should recall that the historic discovery of that post of black patriots, reliable, worthy citizens, who could participate as fully as anyone else in the nation's acts of mourning Princess Diana, despite the exclusion and discrimination that persistently delimit their lives, was a surprise to influential people here. The incredulity with which the appearance of that law-abiding, unspectacular blackness was registered by the liberal media was itself an alarming symptom of how much work there is still to do in demystifying racial difference and in reconfiguring Britishness. The real surprise generated by the belated discovery that blacks could be ordinary should qualify any optimism we might want to feel now, that we might discover in the epiphany of the Ian Wright generation. This is another way, then, of saying that London's multiculture will not necessarily take care of itself. It will not take care of itself as a private phenomenon, organically and spontaneously, without being allowed to become an object of explicit political processes and interventions. The experiential and cultural sources of yearning for racial division to be placed in the past need to be appreciated sympathetically. But I don't want just to endorse those rather overly optimistic portraits of our city that understandable yearning can promote. We need to try here, in the next couple of days, to examine the histories to which those claims to have passed beyond racism into some post-colonial space refer. And we may find, in engaging in that work, and it is work, that London's cosmopolitan post-cultures are more fragmented, more fragile, more unevenly developed formations than the stronger versions of that automatic multicultural thesis would lead us to believe. It's hard to name, but if, I think, in following that agenda we can set aside the desire, the temptation to prematurely celebrate the victories of British tolerance and the irresistible rise of what might be called London's hybrid commonwealth, there are now important processes to be explored. Against the compelling urge to become cheerleaders of some stillborn cosmopolis, we might strive instead to practice a careful and almost forensic approach to multiculture's metropolitan genealogies. This project, though, requires a historical orientation, but it's a rebranded history, to borrow a word from my betters, a rebranded history, one that needs to be conceptualized on a different scale, one that must be uncoupled from the conventions of imperial geopolitics. Before then we can be plausibly post anything, we have to comprehend the colonial character of this city in a more profound manner than has happened before. And secondly, we have to be able to imagine, to produce histories of the city in this century which allow the presence of diverse and colonial peoples and their stubbornly non-colonial descendants of far greater significance than they've been allowed in the past. I'm sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. The shortest walk in the shadow of that infamous mosque in Finsbury Park will confirm that contemporary calculations must involve more than just British colonial history. We'll have to adjust the threshold of our sense of the present and rethink the ways in which the histories of this metropolis might be periodized. Foregrounding the workings of empire and the great shock of its demise enforces some unorthodox historiographic sensibilities. The battles for 1958 begin, for example, to acquire a much more substantive significance. The conflicts with neo-fascist groups that ran through much of the 70s appear less like a distraction from the real political business of opposing governmental racism and become instead a significant political and cultural intervention crucial in turning what are still routinely misidentified as youth cultures away from the possibility of an ultranationalist politics. The history of the GLC and ILEA and other local government initiatives around race and ethnicity in policing should not just be written out of this post-Macpherson story as expressions of a juvenilia that had to be dispensed with on the yellow brick road to the citadel of sensible power. And more recent events have provided some valuable cues for these large critical projects in the rethinking of London's history. The likely re-emergence of municipal government is one factor that's driving this activity forwards. But I don't need to remind you that we are assembled here to consider London's post-colonial predicament just as the convulsions around British racism in general and the multiple injustices arising from the murder of Stephen Lawrence in particular are part of all our thoughts. It would be derelict of us to begin our discussions here without taking advantage of this special opportunity to reflect on the way in which that episode has changed our sense of our city, its colonial histories, its past and its neo-colonial topographies. However necessary then, the universal resonance of the Lawrence family's campaign for justice can obscure the layers of neighbourhood narrative in which their long battle was enveloped. The significance of the Lawrence family's tragedy for their immediate location brought another dimension of meaning to that campaign, which seems to have become a means of remaking a place. If it hasn't become that yet, we have to make it a means of remaking this place, this city, of ontologizing it differently. And though their places of memory are less visible in the media, perhaps, similar local effects have been evident in the protracted battles of other families who have lost their loved ones struck down in the street by freelance white supremacists or killed at the hands and the feet of police officers, prison warders and immigration authorities with their malicious chokeholds and their lethal rolls of sticky tape. These continuing struggles testify for several generations of black Londoners whose protests against police indifference and hostility were ignored and dismissed and ridiculed, but they might also now lend their voice to the emergent figure of a black Europe that is in the process of finding its own insubordinate, its own fearless ways of talking back to power. The national trauma that culminated 2 weeks ago in all those agonized trips made by the liberal and the not-so-liberal media into the racist hell they discovered on the estates of Kentish London can usefully be traced back at least 100 years. One route proceeds via the New Cross Inferno, in which 13 other young black people died, and the contending moral economies marked so effectively by the idea of racial division first assumed an obvious public shape. From there we might pass back through the histories of Southall and Brixton, of Tottenham and Lewisham and Brick Lane, until we reach 20th century London's key symbolic locations of unwanted alien settlement, Notting Hill in the west and Stepney in the east. The first now made over into the home turf of New Labour by the hyper-gentrification of the 90s. The second the second transformed by the perverse elaboration of Mrs. Thatcher's Dockland folly and the damaging infrastructure that supports it. It's worth recalling that the local newspapers covering the race riots in Stepney in 1919, in Canning Town and other areas of the East End, reported that revolvers and choppers and steels were at play during those events. And London's police have not forgotten the sequence that I described, and nor should we. The point that I'm making, though, is a different one here. The point is that there is a challenge, a new challenge involved in trying to make that history part of the official memory of this city. And the apparent continuity of black and settler victimization in this century takes shape, I think, between the useful symbolic markers supplied on the one hand by Major William Evans Gordon, the MP for Stepney, in the early years of the 20th century, and the figure of Sir Paul Condon on the other. I think that continuity, that sense of continuity defined by those histories of suffering, is something that can mask the fact that London was a remarkably different city even 20 years ago. When that march of protest from New Cross finally snaked its way onto the north bank of the Thames, policing had not been effectively militarised. Surveillance cameras were scarce and mobile phones were unknown. The spatial concentration of information and cultural capital in Fleet Street was intact. The Isle of Dogs was still the Isle of Dogs, and Ken Livingstone was a peripheral figure unknown outside the cabal of the London Labour Party. Globalisation was not a word that was widely known or used then, though there were, of course, myriad ways in which this city, established so long before the nation and the state to which it's always linked had even taken shape, had already reached out across the world and brought that conflictual and divided world into itself. Its physical contours and its cultural and institutional life alike bear the imprint of distant experiences and an extensive planetary circuitry. I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong button again. Michael Port's path-breaking studies of London's imperial buildings might provide one provocative and memorable instance of what these inquiries might become. But the colonial intimacies that have given the city so much of its character possess other, if you like, affective dimensions. And seeking another genealogy, one in which the iconic and central figure of Stephen Lawrence might find a fitting position, our thoughts may be drawn irresistibly back to the nomadic life of that original African Englishman, Oluwade Equiano. He, if you recall, found himself trapped on a boat in the Thames in Deptford, 1762, locked in an unexpected confrontation with a master that he tells his readers he loved, like a son. Desperate to gain the safety of the city on the riverbanks, where both men knew that his freedom would be secured, Equiano found himself instead being sold from one master to another, within sight of the shore he was unable to reach. His sharp diaspora sense of the promise that London represented was especially acute, I think. And today it alerts us not just to a view of the river as a jugular vein of empire, but to a sense of the Thames as an unpredictable and powerful force in the life of this place that has been observed with special insight and precision by some sensitive immigrant voices as diverse as those of Ewan MacColl and Joseph Conrad. Think, for example, of those extraordinary opening pages of Heart of Darkness, where Marlowe observes that London's role as a point of departure for many, numerous, catastrophic colonial adventures had made this city into one of the dark places of the earth. I'm quoting Conrad. They sailed from Deptford, from Greenwich, from Erith. The adventurers and settlers, hunters for gold or pursuers of fame, they had all gone out on that stream, bearing the sword and often the torch, messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of the unknown earth, the dreams of men, the seeds of commonwealths, the germs of empires. The circuitry of Conrad's own life produces another sense of London as a destination. And post-colonial sensibility necessitates fresh ways to acknowledge the histories of migration and the waves of migrants that have given so much energy to the life of this city and those who, like Stephen Lawrence, gave their lives to it while changing incrementally, glacially, what it means to be English in the process. Here I want to remember Kelso Cochrane and Altaf Ali, Blair Peach and Gurdeep Singh Chugga, Aseta Sims and Joy Gardner, who are only a few of the best-known names to commemorate in this special category. Their lives prompt a further moment in the reflection on our local politics of remembrance, and they suggest a picture of Middle England and Inner London locked in an insurmountable conflict over what the future of this country is to be. The contemporary event that begins with that murder requires us also to turn in a different direction. No. It's that one. No, it's that one. Right. It requires us to turn in a different direction too. It represents the end of that overlong phase in which Britain's and London's racial politics could be projected via the idea of immigration. Whatever happens next, claims made by this city's black and other minority citizens will not in future be dismissed with the absurd notion that they're only temporarily resident here. In a sense, then, the story of the Lawrence family's quest for justice resonates so powerfully because it presents the final demise of Enoch Powell's long and definitive definition of the dimensions of race as a problem for this nation that was manifest in distinctively urban conflicts and saturated with national and ethnic symbolism. That murder and the responses to it triggered an emphatically, if you like, suburban tableau that has finally displaced that primal scene represented by inner city conflict between an aged and an infirm white woman and the white, wide-grinning pickaninnies who push excreta through her letterbox. Powell's enduring authority was, you will recall, still invoked in the private conversation of the 5 suspects captured at play with their knives. I have had my say about Powell elsewhere, and I don't want to waste time on him today, but I do want to say one thing briefly about the way in which his best-known intervention into the politics of race and nation is to be remembered as the rivers of blood speech. This is what happens when the wide-grinning pickaninnies grow up. They're still in conflict with the white women with whom they exchange their body fluids, as you can see. Powell was not a Londoner. In one of modern British politics' more tasty ironies, he came to us from the Black Country. And in judging his legacy, we would do well to remember that there are more kilometres of canal in Birmingham than in Venice, and to dwell on the significance of the Bourne and the Avon for the Industrial Revolution in the Midlands. But none of that can undo the fact that there is no river in Birmingham. The cornerstone he supplied to the embattled edifice of race relations was that foundational image of an English river foaming with much blood. It was not aimed at the quiet rural worlds not far from his inner city constituency. It was precisely targeted at the life of this disorderly city. The working class men who marched from the docks in support of their beloved Enoch looked at that river, looked at that Thames every day. It flowed past them and helped to constitute them and their traditions, their identities. Today, they're probably the fathers and grandfathers, cousins, mates and uncles of lost, spiteful and anxious young men like the Acourts and their crew. They responded viscerally to the vivid possibility of a race war that was linked in Powell's text to the liquid contamination that the Atlantic Ocean had conducted right into the vulnerable, generous heart of London. Quoting him now too. As I look ahead, I'm filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. Let me get rid of it now. I want to get that back. Sorry. That's reverse, so it's that. No. That's right. This is forward. Right. Sorry about that. As I look ahead, I'm filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, but which is there interwoven with the history of the States itself, is coming upon us by our own volition and our own neglect. To the apprehensive 12-year-old I was then, Powell's words conjured up reddened images of the muddy Thames water I had first glimpsed from the vantage point of Cleopatra's Needle, close to the Embankment Gardens where I sat on the grass with my grandmother. A year or so later, when I was a teenager, Powell's observations became inextricably linked in my mind to the watery death of that pathetic homeless figure, David Oluwale, hounded to his death in the icy water of the river air by Elliker and Kitching, the West Yorkshire police officers who had decided to systematically make his life unlivable, it was clear to me at that moment exactly whose blood Powell had in mind. The rate of transformation may be slow, progress may be fitful and chaotic, but things do change. We need to be able to understand how they have changed. I'm not nostalgic for the days when police officers tormented blacks for sport, but we need to recall them in order to bring a vigorous historical perspective to bear on our current predicament. Remembering that time is particularly useful when we focus on the political and moral responses, which now seek to confine the problem of racism to those 2 or 3 wild and, in a sense, exceptional locations, like the frontiers of Kentish London, in which we're told violent white supremacists currently feel at home, or to disperse it so evenly and extensively into all Britain's institutions so that it reveals nothing specific about London's political geography. The wider class and cultural conflicts that make this nation, this city, comfortable with the image of those 5 young men rather than, say, Richard Tilt, director of the prison service, the one who believes blacks have different necks from everybody else, as the embodiment of the racist you love to hate. He kept his job. He kept his job. Before we laugh at it, let's remember he kept his job, and if things have changed as much as they are supposed to have changed, then he would have been out now. They press us, I think. Thinking about that problem presses us towards asking whether the proper name Eltham refers to somewhere in London or somewhere else, an island in a multicultural stream fortified against the encroachments of black settlers. I don't know, but I think that negative diagnosis is challenged by the fact that the Lawrence family and the police have been given the names of the perpetrators within hours of that killing, a disturbing and complicating element in that grand narrative of English decency, but one that promises something significant for the future. But as soon as I say that, I feel a note of caution has got to be said as well. London's post-colonial history shows that an intense appreciation of the exotic fruits of colonial culture has not always led to a parallel love or promoted even a respect for the people who produced that. Within the same issue of the Evening Standard, we have colonial comfort in the safari style, whilst on the front another charged story, which is part of putting things back the way they were in the familiar grammar and logic of a race-coded world. So London's post-colonial history shows that loving black culture, appreciating and reappreciating colonial histories and post-colonial histories don't necessarily promote a love or respect for the people who make those gifts. And whatever common class position and consciousness, proximity, and a substantial measure of shared experience contribute in the way of centripetal force, there are no guarantees of mutual respect or commonality. Indeed, you could say that the allure of exotic culture may have even been enhanced by the deepening of social and cultural segregation, which is going on in the city now. This change, I think, effectively separates London's carnival of transcultural consumption and play from the troubled lives and colonial histories of its exotic and supposedly primitive producers. It's that one. If the pensioners remain shocked and fearful, it's clear that their grandchildren have been seduced into the pleasures of degeneration. The transgressions of the excluded and the underclass are in harmony here with the power of corporate multiculture, which has arrested Britain's post-colonial identities for its own purposes. The visual languages and representational codes within which that national and ethnic identity becomes visible, legible, and apparent are themselves colonized by the globalizing and corporate interests of a range of different Americocentric imperialisms. The resulting visual culture racializes difference to produce what we might read as post-colonial exotica, with a high commercial value. It departs sharply from earlier patterns which made visible differences into nothing but emblems of misery and insult. The alien refugees who have settled across the street or down the road from you are consigned to the permanent twilight of their infra-humanity, while the iconic superhuman figures of Michael Jordan and co. look down, smiling benevolently from on high. This appears at first to be a matter of ethnicity, but it's a matter of class as well. Oh, I've gone the wrong way again. It's forward. It's a matter of class as well. And the interarticulation of class and ethnicity was underlined recently for me when one leading member of our black elite, with precious access to the infotainment pages, squandered that rare gift with a portentous announcement in one of his columns that he was fleeing the dysfunctional and antisocial inner urban world of the black poor, and in line with some American model, was taking his young children to the leafy safety of the suburbs. Prominent representatives of this soon-to-be black middle class can now find a niche in calm, semi-detached locations at the end of lines, or perhaps, like their white peers whose interest they serve as brokers of difference, opt to dwell in those cobbled developments with controlled security access, from which residents now venture to and fro in the style and status of military vehicles with names like Stealth, Patrol, Explorer, Discovery, and Shogun. The accelerating process of postmodern segregation by wealth is something more than the old developmental conflict that nourished this city while expressing social and economic and political antagonisms in its very form. Deindustrialization is combined with them, and the privatization of space and movement within the metropolis in ways that oblige us to recall Frantz Fanon's potent image of the colonial city as composed of proximate but separate worlds that met only under the force of law, only in the barracks and the police station. Britain's colonial administrators, whose analysis of these problems yielded a rather different discourse on plural societies that might counterpoint and dispute Fanon's own, had another vision. They argued that the different incommensurable groups ruled by colonial authority would meet in a marketplace to which none of them laid claim. Today, though I think that idea has some minimal endo-colonial life in it, the situation is different. The crowd in the marketplace is being dispersed into its private means of coming and going, and public space is ebbing away, shrunk to the dimensions between the glass of one gridlocked car and the next. The marketplace has been edged out of the picture by carefully targeted marketing operations that seek to command the truths of consumer identities, and their operations which orchestrate economic, cultural and psychological components, conscripting their addressees into desires they cannot refuse and identifications they cannot control. We should remember that it was apartheid that was provided Fanon's paradigmatic instance of the pure spatial separation that characterized the colonial city. Though social and cultural segregation is increasing, it would be immoral, I think, to apply that concept unmodified here, where barriers, though higher and sharper than they were, do remain permeable. However, in considering the economic and social development of post-colonial London, we must also be prepared to explore how the process identified some years ago by André Gortz as South Africanization might be thought of as underway here too. Of course, Gortz has taken the term from another stage in South African history than the one in which we're in now, but I think it travels well, and I think it illuminates the consolidation of many social and economic relations associated historically with colonial societies in the heart of overdevelopment. The appearance of those gated and secure residential spaces is one important component of that change. The proliferation of service work, the reappearance of a caste of servile, insecure and underpaid domestic labourers, carers, cleaners, deliverers, messengers, attendants and guards are surely others. The segmentation and casualisation of employment and health and dwelling are the foundations on which these aspects of the destruction of London's civic order have come to rest. To that preliminary list, we could add some of the changes that have impacted directly and negatively on the life of this city: lotterification and the corrosive privatisation of transport, as well as the larger cultural shifts like the growing governmental investment in sports spectatorship, which has become a ready-made, if mechanical, means to build and to channel the post-colonial national consciousness, which is currently struggling to distinguish itself from the 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup variety of belligerent alcohol-fueled nativism. Perhaps it's easy in the light of that to think of why, in the light of those traditional definitions of English culture, why so many Londoners might systematically seek out the post-colonial alternatives, why they might want to use the idea of a break, of a rupture in race politics as a way of expressing and affirming their turn away from the morbidities involved in living in an old country. But I think it bears repetition that the love of exotica, which arises in this confusion, from this confusion is tied to a situation in which glamorous and unfamiliar cultures can be consumed in the absence of any face-to-face recognition or real-time negotiation with their creators. That desire, the desire for what was formerly stigmatized and forbidden, might also be interpreted as another symptom of the collapse of English cultural confidence that has fed the development of anxious and insecure local and national identities. Today's hatreds and violence arise less than they did in the past from the supposedly reliable anthropological knowledge of the identity and the difference of the other. Their new source lies perhaps in the problem of not being able to locate the difference of the other in the common sense lexicon of alterity. Different people are still hated and feared, but the antipathy against them is nothing compared to the hatreds turned towards the greater menace of the half-different, the only partially familiar. To have mixed is to have been party to a great betrayal. Any unsettling traces of that mixture must be excised from the tidy, bleached-out zones of an impossibly pure culture. The loss of stability and certainty these changes manifest is inseparable from the cultural flux of post-colonial life in the city. It's produced anxieties about the limits and character of England's archetypal ethnic identities, Cockney, Brummie, Scouse and Geordie, and the integrity of the larger formation to which they contribute. It can be registered also, I think, through the concern of what should be put inside that dome. What should go in there, in this moment? Should it be sacred? Should it be secular? Should it be Diana or Queen Mum? Should it have McDonald's logo on it? Amidst that clamour over the boundaries of the rebranded and modernised Britain are the vexing questions of whether Britons of colour are, after all, to be in that picture culturally, or whether their extensive gifts to England are to be dignified by a belated degree of, I don't know what we call it, overground recognition. Here, it seems to me that the forces of governmental populism and the forces of corporate multiculture begin to diverge. The government fear a white backlash, while the latter, corporate multiculture, has shed its discomfort with otherness and blackness on the shore of a sea of cash. McDonald's have no qualms about using black actors in their pioneering advertisements. And, more significantly still, it's William and Fionn, rather than Tony and Cherie, who feel compelled to demonstrate their informal modernity by practicing the post-colonial arts of jumping up in the grove. Time and again, it's London that supplies the answer to the puzzle of what that English culture is going to be. I'm not a member of a migrant generation. I'm a technical Cockney. I was born within the sound of Bow Bells. I might not sound like it, but that's where I was born. And perhaps that's why I'm determined not to be defensive about my appetite for a cosmopolitan city in which identity is allowed to be complex. The choice in front of us seems, I think, a start point. We can move towards the renunciation of the intrinsic absurdities of race, or we can choose to remain within the hall of distorting colonial mirrors. And in choosing and following what I see as the more cautious, the more conservative path, we would be opting to reenact the dramatic process of that original primal scene that Fanon staged for us. It involves, you may remember, the figure of a deeply ambivalent immigrant to the metropole. He sees himself being seen and feels the bodily trauma of being captured by the gaze of essentially hostile white onlookers who feel free to amputate his humanity. There in the street, perhaps on a bus, they perceive nothing in his apologetic and familiar colonial presence, save the unchanging dimensions of an ineffable difference from them. Now, I don't think we should try to play down the significance of that instructive urban encounter. I don't think we should seek to evade the elemental force of similar, not quite confrontations with the casual codes of an unthinking white supremacism. But before we decide over-defensively to repeat that odd and troubling scene indefinitely, as it were by default, we should note that Europe's imperial potency is no longer intact. It's been succeeded by a corporate neocolonialism with new emphases and different effects than those of its predecessors. And here, on the edge of this new epoch we're told is about to start, we can begin to inquire into the possibility of moving beyond and beneath that old colonial drama into more forward-looking and more assertive stances. This new position could identify a dissenting place in Britain's emergent multicultural polity with a new understanding of identity, specified by some equally novel ways of comprehending and figuring our humanity, and of making and writing, of manifesting London's history. Thank you.
I think I just need Paul to ask you. I wonder if I might start by I kept on saying you mustn't be too optimistic, but at the same time, it seemed to me that there perhaps wasn't enough recognition in your talk of the grounds for optimism.
Well, that depends on what you think the grounds for optimism are. I mean, my grounds for optimism.
Yeah.
I mean, my optimistic moments. Well, I suppose I emphasise the irreversibility. I don't think you can rewind the tape to where we were before, and I think it's that irreversibility, that irreversibility combined with, some adjustments to the way we think about how things change, because things move and then they stop, they freeze. We need a sort of, a geopolitical sense, in the sense that geological time is more the kind of time in which those things have changed. So I think we need to adjust our understanding of how things change. But it's the irreversibility of that change and the fact that we know more about it than them, which is interesting to me. It seems to me that government at all its levels, for a variety of reasons to do with what's been going on in this country for the last 20 years, haven't a clue about any of this stuff. And I think that actually gives us, if I can say us, gives us an advantage, and I think that gives us a different role, and it's not the role of being a broker of difference. It's not the role of turning this into something with a commercial value. It's actually a different challenge. It's a challenge of turning this history into something that has a moral value that we can offer them, if they aren't tone deaf to it. So that's my grounds for optimism. But then it's like the weather, really. You don't know what's going to happen next. Right? I mean, there are all sorts of formulae that people have for thinking the combinations of optimism and pessimism, and it's not worth repeating them here. I want to take them as sort of for granted, really. Someone at the back? No? No, sorry, you were just playing with your pen. Right. Oh, come on here and then you. Okay. Yes, I mean, I was thinking, actually, when you were speaking of Huguette Fatner, the woman from Martinique who chairs the external division of the Front National, who is known in the discourse as Le Pen's Negresse, I was thinking about what will happen when there's some vocal and authoritative black Tories in that political frame that aren't really there at the moment. And I'm sure that, that will be an interesting development. I think that, how can I put it? I think that the historical impulse is the one I feel I wanted to emphasize, because it's almost as though, we went from Scarman to Macpherson without any sense of the complicated history of tragedy and of triumph within those two poles. It's almost like it was compressed, and I don't. It's not just a sort of personal mission. I feel strongly about the ways in which the memory of London government is recovered, because I worked in County Hall for 3.5 years, clambering over these boxes full of pamphlets that got sent out to people after adverts were placed in the Sun that explained what racism was. And I know from my 3 years of working there that those boxes disappeared, so they went somewhere. Do you know what I mean? They went somewhere. They weren't sent to the landfill. They were sent out in envelopes, that were paid for on the rates. So, I actually want to recover some of that work. And it's not just governmental work and local governmental work. In fact, local government, what's been very interesting about the recent phase is how much those groups like New Monitoring Project and Gakara and other groups that were so pivotal in bringing this new phase into life were groups that were set up and funded by the GLC initiatives originally. And of course, Ken Livingstone and Tony Banks and all these other powerful people aren't very inclined to own that history and own their implication in what was something they were inclined to write off as juvenilia.
Well, yeah, I just actually had a very quick question. I just wondered what you thought of the report, the report about the police, the Lawrence report, because on the one hand, I think you expressed a certain amount of optimism about that. It occurs to me that although racism can be institutionalized, or certainly is institutionalized, in many ways it's a grassroots movement, and I'm actually very skeptical that any kind of modifications of institutions are going to make any difference with respect to racism.
Well, I don't want to dismiss. I remember when we were working in the GLC one day, a senior policeman whose career didn't quite work out the way he planned came in and sat down with us in our office, and he said, I have to teach this. I have to teach these people, what reasonable suspicion is. And we said, oh yeah. He said, but I don't know what reasonable suspicion is. I don't know. And I often remember that, and looking at the public protagonists in this post-Macpherson situation, they are people who, very often have had long histories in this area of political conflict, and who aren't able to bring a historical perspective to bear on that. So I think the difference of corporate management, bringing the language of management and corporate thinking into the police service, is a big difference. I'm not saying it's going to get rid of racism. Of course I'm not saying that. But I wouldn't want to say that threshold was an insignificant thing to have crossed. So when you have Scarman plus managerialism, which is, a serious thing when you think about what police officers actually do and what police institutions are like from a management point of view. People think of the police, they see all the military trappings, and they think it's a military organisation. They think it's an organisation where the people at the top of the pyramid give commands and the people underneath follow them. It's ridiculous. No one in the police service for more than 20 or 30 years has ever thought that's what was going on. Actually the people at the top are dependent on the people at the bottom, who enjoy an autonomy to fill their own jobs and their own time with an incredible permissive creativity. They have a permissive relationship to the law which backs them up and enables them to do basically what they want for as long as they want. Okay? That's what that organisation is in management terms. So to bring a management language into that, I think is something which is significant. And there's a lot of other stuff buried in the report, probably, I don't know whether it will ever come to anything, but that relates to, procedures in other aspects of the criminal justice system, which are really significant and important if they're followed up around the conduct of inquests and other questions like that. Now, what I objected to was what I take to be the post-Macpherson settlement, which says on the one hand we have the image of racism, which is these 5 odious, hateful young men, right? Which is actually in many ways a very comfortable image for racism to have in this society, right? And on the other hand we have this idea that racism in all our institutions is there equally thick. It's like a fall of snow, it covers everything with the same even blanket. There's a bit of a snowdrift over there where the police are, But apart from that, everything is uniformly racist in the same ways, in the same dimensions. And I think as a settlement, if it's a choice between those two things, then we are stuck, and we will be stuck, you know. And what's interesting is actually nobody seems to appreciate the depths of the crisis involved in finding a political language to talk about this anymore. It's like the nomenclature, the formulations, all of them are worn out. They don't fit. You know, yesterday on the radio they were talking about the educational report, which is very important opportunity to recover the fact that, you know, there was the ILA and a lot of other things that talked about multicultural education, produced course materials and support for young people who might have been disenchanted with school for the fact that their teachers were racist and the institution of the school offered them a soccer ball and all the rest of it, instead of, you know, the discipline involved in working. I'm not saying it's only a problem for the schools, you know, but there's an opportunity there. And instead, what do we get? You know, an incredible confusion. A confusion prompted, I think, partly from the fact that the only way that people seem to be able to bring the object into focus was by piling on the adjectives, you know, a sort of desperate move. It's like black, African, Caribbean boys, you know, the qualifying adjectives just pile up and up and up, and all the time the object slips out of sight. So I think there's a real crisis about how race is to be thought now, and there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity here, you know, there's an opportunity. You know, now whether or not the people in government, are actually inclined to make the most of that opportunity is another question. And I don't feel I have my views about that, but I don't think I want to claim any privilege in them articulating them here, because there are other people here who know more about that than me.
Do I have to start again, or was that all right?
Well, I heard you, but maybe other people didn't, so perhaps you should start again.
Okay, well, I recognise Paul Gilroy's description of his of being by Cleopatra's Needle and reflecting on Enoch Powell's speech when he was 12, and that I remember that very clearly, and also its effect on the dockers, and, you know, follow that thread through to the Accords, who, you know, as eventual descendants of a certain alienated working class constituency. And also your comment about the prison officer whose name I can't remember, who thinks that blacks have thicker necks, the fact that he's doing his job. Yeah. So my question really is, and this follows on from what you were saying just now about the loss of any language with which to discuss this or dissect it. How does one, is there anything we're going to say here in 2 days which is anything to do with addressing that constituency, which is the one that's almost always outside this debate, in a way that they are the biggest sort of secret fear, including the fear of the middle class racists, who for whom they also represent an opportunity, because they are the sort of shock troops and so on. But is there any way that we can grapple directly in any other arena than sort of a street fight with that constituency? Because, I mean, I've lived with people like that. I have no doubt that there were people in my street who could easily have been the Accords in their own time.
Well, I mean, you know, there again, you know, we can lose our memories to suggest that, you know, what we used to call anti-racist politics tried for over a very long period of time to identify the needs of precisely those people and to speak to those needs. I would say that bringing that back into the frame would be a start, but that actually in the longer term, in that more assertive and forward-looking mode, that actually a revival of a civic culture in London would be the way to address those constituencies, so they don't feel that their rights. What is it Derek Beacon was saying when he got elected to the council in Tower Hamlets? Rights for whites. You know, that they don't feel that their political rights have been torn away from them. Now, but again, I think that actually comes down to kind of civic and governmental order is going to re-emerge from this. And it's clear, that if it's in the interest of the government that, having an American style, so much condensed into that extraordinary little phrase there, an American style mayor, may not be an adequate resource with which to really begin to address those questions, given, the privatization and destruction of a number of other sort of key institutions in the civic life of the city. Okay, I've been told that's got to be my last one.
We've got several other things happening, so I'm going to have the last question. I'd just like to thank you all very much indeed for very stimulating.
Thank you, Paul. Stephen Lawrence's tragic death led to, among other things, a trust being set up. Stephen had wished to become an architect. The specific purpose of the trust is to help those who wish to pursue a career in architecture. With the support of the trust, in particular Arthur Timothy and John Snow and the Lawrence family, the AA has received from a very generous donor funding to enable us to commence a full scholarship here in the name of Stephen Lawrence. It's our hope to raise sufficient funding to award a new Stephen Lawrence scholarship every year. The American political philosopher Iris Marion Young, in her book Justice and the Politics of Difference, discusses alternative forms of justice to those based on economics and distributive forms of justice. Discourse about justice, according to Marion Young, is not motivated originally by curiosity, a sense of wonder, or the desire to figure out how things work. The sense of justice arises not from looking, but as Jean-François Lyotard says, from listening. For us, a language is first and foremost someone talking. But there are language games in which the important thing is to listen, in which the rule deals with audition. Such a game is the game of the just. And in this game, one speaks only in as much as one listens. That is, one speaks as a listener and not as an author. For the past 6 years, through their wisdom, determination, and courage, Doreen and Neville Lawrence have managed to persuade so many of us to speak as listeners. Would you please welcome Doreen and Neville Lawrence, who will say a few words.
I've been very enlightened this evening listening to Paul Gilroy's speech, and I was really taken by the depth of his speech this evening. To think that Stephen sort of come from such a humble beginning to sort of reach this accolade, that his name is mentioned in practically, every institution now, that he's seen as the spearhead for change. Part of it is a good feeling to know that Stephen's name is so well known everywhere, but the other part is that, it caused some pain, that it took his death to have brought such a change in this country. He's not the first to have died in the way in which he had died, and I'm sure he won't be the last. But I'm hoping that in another situation, that if Stephen's death can do so much, there's a saying that, if this can happen, I'm so well pleased. I'm pleased, but I'm not pleased, if you can understand. That's not what I'm saying. And I wish to thank the benefactor for setting up this scholarship in Stephen's name. And one day I hope to be standing next to the person who was given this scholarship, and for him to achieve his goal in life that was denied of Stephen. And really, that's what I like to say. And thank everybody very much. And I'm hoping that the trust will be a success, because I think with the determination of everybody, since it's been set up. I'm sure it will be. And thank you all.
I would also like to thank everybody and to mention two names that has been mentioned this evening, which is Roland Adams and Royal Amish. And Amish was the last boy was killed, say about 300 yards from where my son was killed. And today I heard some good news which made me feel really good, that the person who they think killed the Menson's boy was arrested. And I'm hoping that they've got the right person. And also, it's because of what we've done and our preservation that 2 years after the murder, they finally decide to arrest the people who was maybe alleged to have killed this boy. And it now shows how determination can pay off at the end of the day. And we hope that through the scholarship, anybody who takes up the scholarship will be determined to go to the end, and so 7 years or so we'll be seeing the fruits of our labor. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to move now to the announcement of the prize winners of the photographic competition. I hope that those who've been here today have had the opportunity to see the exhibition Post-Colonial London, which is put on as a kind of joint venture by the Architectural Association and sponsored by the new graduate school, the London Consortium. I'm now going to ask one of the judges, Yass, to come to kind of present the prizes. Yass.
I was really delighted when I was asked to be involved in the competition, because I think that it raises so many crucial issues to do with who sees London, who occupies it, and all the different kinds of visual languages which are developing. I also think that it was really important that so many different bodies were approached, and the response came from such a wide number of artists, photographers, colleges, and I think that the results of the competition reflect this diversity. So I'm going to begin by announcing the 5 commended entries, and then I'll give the third prize, second prize and first prize. So of the commended entries, there's Sandra Frisch. Is she here? Congratulations. There you go. Oliver Zwink. There you go. Well done. John Aldous. Is he here? Oh, well. Yeah. There you go. Ed Whittaker. There you go. Horst Friedrichs. Third prize goes to Haris Pelopaisiotis. No? Oh, it'll be a nice surprise for him later. Okay. Second prize goes to Mailing 2, or Toe, I don't know how to say it. There you go, congratulations. And first prize goes to Tim Brotherton. Congratulations. Well done. That's great. Cheers. Great.
Okay, I think we can now kind of conclude this part of the evening and move upstairs to eat. Okay, thank you very much indeed.